and welcome to Ask a Historian. My name is Justine Lyn. I'm the Resource Center Assistant here with Heritage Mississauga, and each week we invite you to send in your questions as we explore a bit about the history of the city of Mississauga. And we also encourage you to like, subscribe, and follow to stay up to date on all the heritage happenings here with Heritage Mississauga. So today, of course, we have Matthew here, our historian, and so this is a bit different because I'm sure everyone at home is used to Matthew being the host, but today he's in the hot seat. So, no pressure, Matthew. We're gonna just chit chat a little bit about the Battle of Vimy Ridge, the anniversary of which is coming up. So Matthew, I just wanted to, start off with, for those of us at home that maybe don't know a lot about the Battle of Vimy Ridge, can you just kind of tell us in broad strokes a bit about this?
Absolutely. And, this is a change of hat normally. Normally it's me on the other side. And I do think in this program, I kind of like this. This is kind of neat. So maybe we should do more of these. Absolutely. We have, fast upon us here is the anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which took place in 1917. And I'm not great with math, but 105 years ago. It is a pivotal moment in perhaps not necessarily the First World War itself, although we'll talk about that, but really in the idea of, Canadian identity in the First World War, and of course, what would the years that would follow, leading to an increase in Canadian pride, Canadian nationalism, that used Vimy Ridge as kind of a propaganda of a sense in terms of building a Canadian identity. And one historian noted that the Battle of Vimy Ridge was not important in the war, but it was important. And we'll kind of explore both of those. So, but just kind of an overview of Vimy Ridge. Vimy is a name that rings down through Canadian history. I think I dare say if you canvass people today, most people have heard of Vimy, even if they're not entirely sure of what it was or when it took place. For those that don't know the what, when, and why, Vimy as a word is really connected to remembrance and sacrifice. Again, even over 105 years later. The Battle of Vimy Ridge took place from April 9th to 12th of 1917. It was part of a larger Allied offensive in the First World War, which was known as the Arras Offensive, that took place in the spring of 1917, for really what was the young nation of Canada. And Canada did not control its own military policy in the First World War. We were part of the British Empire. But for the young nation of Canada that aspired to kind of independent nationhood, if you will, it became a symbol of, again, Canadian nationalism. The battle strategically had little impact on the course of the war itself, although it was a major achievement by Canadians. The Battle of Vimy Ridge marked the first time that all 4 Canadian divisions of the Canadian Corps fought together, and this followed a treacherous war of attrition, or battle of attrition, at the Somme, in which Canadians and many other Allied troops were decimated. But the victory at Vimy was the largest territorial advance of any Allied force to that point in the war, but it had a high cost. Over 100,000 Canadian soldiers served at Vimy, with 3,598 killed and 7,004 wounded. Again, I mentioned it was part of the Allied offensive at Arras in 1917, and the Canadian Corps were assigned a strategic German high ground, if you will, a German-held strategic point at Vimy. Vimy was protecting kind of an area that was known for its coal fields, and the Germans were determined to hold on to the coal fields. Earlier in the war, both British and French attempts to take the ridge had failed disastrously, but Canadians, they had a long time to prepare for it. And sorry, I might be droning on a little bit on your answer, but just bear with me for a moment. And Canadians had a long time to prepare for it. They were assigned in the winter of 1916 and early 1917 to this section of this line of conflict, if you will, this I guess, combat line, if you will. And so they knew that the objective would be Vimy Ridge, but they had some time to prepare. They had a lot of time to prepare. And one of the neat things about it, there's a fascinating show on YouTube, and I'd highly recommend it. It's an old program called For King and Empire, and it's hosted by famed Canadian military historian Norm Christie. And For King and Empire, it highlights the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and it talks about how over 100,000 Canadian soldiers came to occupy the area around Givenchy and Arras, and other surrounding areas as they kind of dug in for the winter. And what was remarkable about that was it was larger than almost any other Canadian city in terms of population. And think of that at the time, the only cities in Canada that were larger than the amount of Canadians that had, I guess, Canadian soldiers that congregated around Vimy in 1917 were Toronto and Montreal. Every other single city had less population than we had soldiers in that location. So it's remarkable of the story to explore just the sheer enormity that Canadian would have been involved in. I mean, they had the food supplies distributed. They laid 20 kilometers of a railway line, a tram railway line. They used chalk mines to hide underground. They developed a sawmill for lumber and construction projects. In the weeks leading up to the battle, Canadian soldiers raided German positions to gather intelligence. They had air reconnaissance. Like, they were so well prepared for this. They even had a full-scale map of which, right down to the platoon level, companies were trained to know their objectives. There was also new artillery that was what became known as the creeping barrage, or the Vimy glide, as it was known, where the artillery would advance in section as the troops came up behind it. So the advancing troops were shielded by their own smoke of their own artillery as it advanced across the stage. So it was all meticulously timed. And that fell under people like Field Marshal Julian Byng, and of course the famed Canadian military commander Arthur Currie as being the strategist at the time, leading them, preparing their troops for this advance. The 0 hour, if you will, was 5:30 in the morning on April 9th. And that is when after a period of silence, the guns opened up again, and Canadian troops poured out of their trenches and out of their souterrain tunnels and attacked German positions all along the Vimy Ridge. The plan, of course, was always in military, nothing goes according to plan. The plan was to capture the ridge in its entirety in a few hours. Although the Canadian divisions 1, 2, and 3 to kind of the center and south of Vimy did accomplish theirs. Division 4, which was charged with actually the highest and most strategically difficult area, which was known as Hill 145 and the Pimple, they faced steep resistance, of course, as could be expected. And it was the battle, in fact, raged on for several days. And it wasn't until April 12th that finally the Pimple was captured at the north end. And so, this is an enormous moment of Canadian execution, a perfectly timed strategic execution of a plan, and capturing things like the ancient town of Thelu, and capturing German positions, particularly on Hill 145, but to an enormous cost. Ultimately, Canadians did win the day, or win the offensive, or capturing their strategic points, but it came again at a very, very high cost.
Right. So you have this battle where they're all fighting together, and obviously they prepared much for it, and that paid off. Now, back at home, we have the families of these people who are fighting. How is the news back in Canada, and especially here in historic Mississauga? How is that received?
Well, it's interesting. We use the word, Vimy Ridge as kind of like this high point of Canadian achievement, but really the term Vimy wasn't used a lot at the time. It was part of this offensive, part of this larger attack. They had French to the south, they had British just to their north, and it was Vimy was but a piece of a larger spring offensive. And so the newspapers at the time talk about this Canadian achievement, and Vimy was mentioned, but the Battle of Vimy Ridge as as a name wasn't necessarily the front page news in many locations, but the news of the battle did come across overseas. It's hard to sometimes separate, I find, the idea of, propaganda to boost Canadian morale versus, accurate depiction or reporting on the battlefield or of the battle itself. But regardless, the newspapers do carry the story and all that, morale for soldiers, but morale at home is also equally important in understanding how newspapers are conveyed, because they're still trying to drum up troop support. They're still trying to drum up that piece from home. And this idea that, Canadians, 4 divisions of Canadian soldiers, 100,000 strong, representing soldiers from every province, fighting together, achieved a goal. I mean, you're talking about gold propaganda, right? Like this. But the real thing was, it was true, right? Like this is, so not only do you have this, and propaganda sometimes has a negative connotation, and I don't mean in that phrase, but this idea of building nationhood, this idea of building a common spirit, this idea of building Canada, for Canadians, not for Manitobans, not for British Columbians, not for Ontarians and Quebecers, and like this idea that there's a Canadian identity here, and that as Canadians united across, regardless of where we came from, achieving what had essentially been unachievable. Looking in the context of 1915 and 1916 with British and French offenses on Vimy, both disastrous casualties and failed, and yet Canadians, and in many cases, historians also look at Vimy Ridge, the Canadians were not expected to succeed. They were expected to occupy the Germans, so to speak, so that they couldn't reinforce other areas of the offensive. So the idea was Vimy was about a piece of a larger thing, but the Canadians did essentially what was unachievable, and that was capturing the ridge in a very short order of time. So, but newspapers hailed the success of Vimy, no doubt. That was across the board. We see headlines, particularly in the Toronto Star and Globe and Mail, but even local newspapers that start to carry those stories as well. Other areas of the Arras Offensive either failed or stalemated, where Vimy was a massive territorial gain in the context of the offensive itself. And again, that idea of not only as a military achievement that had been was successful, but this idea of uniting people at home for the cause as well, and probably paid. And this is one thing I've not read, and I've always wondered about, is after the spring of 1917, you wonder what the percentage of volunteerism as new people signing up, like, was there a new wave of support at home for soldiers who would enlist to go overseas in the wake of Vimy? You do wonder if there's those kind of connections in as well. And I will admit, I don't know the answer to that, but very much, part of the story here at home was the conveyance of news from overseas. And you do also trickle in the casualties as well. But the casualty report from Vimy comes kind of after the news is the success, so to speak. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that news is a bit delayed.
Yeah.
So, so on the same tact, can we, draw some connections between, historic Mississauga and what was happening in Vimy, and as well, you mentioned around the fallen soldiers as well.
Right. No, absolutely. I wish we could go right to ground zero and kind of pinpoint where our boys were at their day, and we just don't know some of that. Like we know where casualties occurred, but don't necessarily know the context in which they occurred and where they were on the battlefield, so to speak, or in the midst of the offensive. But we've documented at this point 54 soldiers from historic Mississauga who served at Vimy. That number is likely larger because we're talking about all 4 Canadian divisions at that time being at Vimy, minus those that will be held in reserve and minus those that might be, convalescing or not yet crossed the English Channel and that sort of thing. But we would estimate that our number from historic Mississauga would probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 to 100 soldiers being at Vimy. But we can document 50. We have documented 54 who were known to be at Vimy. So, over 50, and we have 7 fallen at Vimy and 11 wounded at Vimy. And that's, numbers in a way become, you kind of lose your emotion to when you start dealing statistics and numbers and that sort of thing. Over 3,000 Canadian soldiers killed and 7,000 wounded at Vimy on the initial, 15,000 some odd advance of the 100,000. Like you just deal with numbers and they become almost overwhelming in that sense. But our rate of casualty is very much in tune with what Canada suffered. Like Mississauga in that sense is a microcosm of the larger Canadian picture. So we do know that some of our soldiers were killed within the first advance on Vimy, and so when units reached their objectives, quite often they were withdrawn and then replaced by new troops as they went on to the next objective, and so on. So this was a very planned attack, but we know one Sergeant Thomas Cartwright of Arundel, that his death, mentioned in his death record, calls killed in the first few moments of advance. And so you'd have to think, okay, we know that the 0 hour is 5:30 in the morning on April 9th. He's probably amongst others waiting in their trenches for that bugle call or the whistle to go over the top. And how scary is that concept? I mean, think of, no man's land littered with craters, not a tree to be seen, barbed wire thrown in ditches and this sort of thing. And that your enemy is, anywhere from say 30 to 100 yards in front of you with likely machine guns and that sort of thing. And then you get the call to go over the top. Like, you're leaving the relative security and safety of a trench, and I say that is relative, and then all of a sudden you're exposing yourself, and that has to be terrifying. But the courage that must have been displayed by those who did it, and Thomas Cartwright probably no different than any of the others that jumped over the top. And as a sergeant, he's in charge of a small section of men, and perhaps at the head of a column, and he succumbs. But yeah, you have these connections. So we know, like, all over the area of Vimy, we have casualties on April 9th, the very first day. We have casualties on the 10th, on the 11th, and on the 12th. Like our soldiers are involved from historic Mississauga. They're involved in every component of the attack on Vimy. And so that's very much kind of defining connections here, Mississauga as a microcosm, if you will. Now, some of the ones involved, and we'll talk about maybe the individual soldiers themselves afterwards, but those that were there that came home afterwards to talk about it. One of the probably the significant ones would be Captain Reverend George Petrie Duncan of Port Credit. He was a chaplain. He was present during Vimy, and he had 3 sons who also served at Vimy. His eldest, not all of them at Vimy, because his eldest son, Captain George Duncan, was killed in 1915. Another son, Captain Alan Duncan, was on leave because of wounds in 1917, was not at Vimy, but was killed in action in 1918. And his third son, Lieutenant Wallace Duncan, was severely wounded at Vimy. So you talk about, a family with giving so much. 2 sons killed in action over the course of the war, and another one severely wounded. He lost eyesight at Vimy. Other set of brothers, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Thompson and Lieutenant Douglas Thompson of Port Credit, served both with distinction at Vimy, and they were both later killed in action in the war. Others from historic Mississauga that served at Vimy, Lieutenant Colonel Agar Adamson, who of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. There's a fantastic book, Letters from Home, that has grouped letters from Agar Adamson to his wife Mabel, who amongst other things talk about their time at Vimy. Also, Captain Franklin Walter Odd of Port Credit, who was later killed in the war. So you have a lot of these ones. Perhaps my famous, but my favorite one, if I could, but obscure in the sense that we don't know much more about him, but it was Corporal Harold Key, who was an electrical worker from Streetsville, but he attended Dixie Presbyterian Church. And we don't know the circumstances of his medal at this point. I'd love to find out more. But at the Battle of Vimy Ridge, he won a military medal, or was awarded a military medal, for gallantry and devotion to duty during the advance on Vimy Ridge, April 9th, 1917.
The last thing I kind of wanted to go back to is, you know, kind of, I guess, you know, hypothesizing why, you know, Vimy kind of, it resonates with us and these stories of, you know, these fallen soldiers and those that served, why they're, you know, they still resonate with us, like you were talking about, over 100 years ago, right? I mean, you know, this wasn't yesterday, right? Like, you know, this is a long time ago. So, you know, why do you think that that is, I guess?
Well, I'm going to read a quick passage here. Just it's a couple of short paragraphs from The Canadians at Vimy by Norm Christie. And it speaks to this a little bit, and says the capture of Vimy Ridge in 1917 was as much a propaganda victory as it was a military one. The year had started with such promise, but quickly turned into the Allies' bleakest year and finally petered out dismally into the morass of Passchendaele. And so the victories of Canadians at Vimy and Arlo in April, and Fresnoy in May, and Hill 70 in August, and Passchendaele in November assumed significant proportions well beyond the reality of the military gains. The reputation of the Canadian Corps and the efficient fighting machine and of Canada itself as a nation were sealed. Canada had earned a voice of its own, and that voice began at Vimy. And so you look at it in those contexts, and you really begin to understand, in a sense, why that resonates so much, not only with, you know, Canadians, but down through time, that even those that perhaps have forgotten Vimy and those that served at Vimy and those that fell there, there's something powerful about that moment in Canadian national character, national identity, and it reflects at home too. Like we have references to Vimy on our landscape. Like all of our two significant war memorials in Streetsville and Port Credit were both erected in the aftermath of the First World War and speak prominently to Vimy. In fact, the Vimy Park has been so named around the Port Credit Memorial down in Port Credit. Mm-hmm. But we have some street names that also connect to areas in Vimy, and down in Lakeview area we have Byng Mount, which is named after Sir Julian Byng, the field marshal from at Vimy, Canadian Field Marshal, and then also the Hague Boulevard is named as well. I mean, we have these connections, and not only that, to those that served and came home, and soldiers that were demobilized after the war. Many of them served at Vimy, and so you kind of have this sense of you know, not only achievement, but dare I say pride that, you know, Canada achieved this thing, even if strategically it was rather inconsequential in the bigger picture of the war. From a Canadian achievement perspective, it was, you know, without equal. And you know, even those that served at home, and if you don't mind, we'll touch on a little bit on some of the stories of those that served and fell, because I think that's the focal point of kind of our research at Heritage Mississauga. But yeah, Private Dennis Anger of Arundel, who was killed on action on March 1st of 1917 during reconnaissance leading up to the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Like, Vimy was so meticulously planned, right, but people's lives were in danger in the planning, and that's an example where he was with an officer who was shot by a sniper, and reportedly Private Anger was killed trying to aid or assist that officer who had been shot, and he himself was shot and killed. He served for the 75th Battalion, which is now the Toronto Scottish, which makes their home here, their armory home, the Colonel Beckett Armory up on top of 9th Line in Mississauga. And so, you know, we have those connections as well. He was only 24 years old when he died. Private Eli Rossiter of Clarkson was killed in action on April 9th of 1817. That's the first day of Vimy, near the village of Thailou at Vimy Ridge. He served with Agar Adamson's unit, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. He was 32 years old and left behind a widow, Hannah, and a young son named Arthur. Hannah remarried, later moved to Pennsylvania, and there are descendants of the family that have been traced to Petrolia, Pennsylvania today. Private Joseph Clark of Streetsville, he was a cook and a baker. You know, these are not soldiers; these are people from communities that had regular jobs. He was killed in action in the initial advance on Vimy at the age of 31. He also served with the 75th. Private William Kidd of Toronto was a resident who for many years worked with George Adamson as a farmhand in Clarkson. Billy, along with his brother Walter, both served overseas and had no immediate family behind him. He served with the 3rd Battalion, today part of the Queen's Own Rifles of Toronto. He was killed in action on April 9th at the age of 32. Sergeant Thomas Cartwright, again, I mentioned him earlier. He worked as a local farmhand. He attended St. Peter's Anglican Church in Arundel and was a well-regarded baseball player, of all things. His notice of his passing in the Toronto Star recounts his baseball career. He had previous military experience with the 36th Peel Regiment, now the Lawrence Scots, before enlisting with the 75th, now the Toronto Scottish. He was killed in the early morning hours of April 9th during the initial Canadian advance at Vimy. He was only 21 years old, but again, a sergeant, so it says he was a person of responsibility. Very little is known about Private Jack Young. He was listed as a farmer and a gardener and worked on the Shook farm in Clarkson. His next of kin was listed as Mrs. Robert Shook of Clarkson. He served with the 33rd Battalion. He was killed in action on April 11th. The other was a Lieutenant James Howard Fawcett, who was born in Streetsville, and his father was the editor of the Streetsville Review newspaper. When James enlisted, he was living in Berks Falls, working with the Berks Falls Arrow newspaper, which his father also owned. His family had resided in Streetsville, and James himself was noted as a hockey and lacrosse player in Streetsville. He was wounded at the Canadian advance at Vimy and died of his wounds on April 12th. He was 28 years of age. And so, you know, we have these stories that pass down, and they're very much like those names are on our cenotaphs. They're in our community. There were people who remembered them. There were streets that were named in honor of those that had some connection to not only First World War, but Vimy as well. You know, people don't name things about moments they want to forget. And you know, Vimy resonated. It resonated with the families of those left behind. It resonated with the fallen. It resonated with our memorials. It resonated in Canadian identity. And I think those are important things to reflect on when we hear the words of Vimy today.
Yeah, and I mean, another thing that I was also just thinking about when you're talking about that is, you know, in some ways, perhaps we're thinking about these things more, you know, with like current events that are happening in the world right now. And you mentioning, you know, we have baseball players, we have bakers, we have, you know, like you were saying, you know, these are not necessarily like, you know, soldiers, like career type soldiers, you know, these are people that enlisted. And, you know, and it reminds me of even, you know, a conversation I was having with my partner, talking about how, you know, well, what would we do? Like, if we had to go to war, like, what would we do? And, you know, and he was basically saying, like, I don't know, like, I'm not a soldier, right? But the thing is, these were the same decisions and same conversations that people would have been having at that time, right? And so perhaps we can kind of, you know, empathize quite a bit, you know, given some of the conversations that are undoubtedly happening now in different parts of the world. So
no, absolutely. Sorry, you're very right. You're very right. The vast majority of Canadian soldiers were not soldiers before they chose to enlist, and we should reflect on that. You know, there may come a time when we need their like again. That's a famous line from a remembrance poem, I guess you call it, called "Just a Common Soldier." And you know, those are that's the ilk of the soldier that stood up not only to serve Canada but to serve a greater cause, and many gave their lives for, of course.
Right. Okay, so with that, I think we will end today's episode. Thank you so much, Matthew, for this insightful view into the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And of course, as well to everyone who is watching at home and probably, you know, contemplating these things themselves. You know, it's always fun and oh, fun is not the right word, but interesting to, you know, delve into these stories around historic Mississauga and our connections elsewhere around the world as well on Ask a Historian. And of course, I would also encourage everyone to please send in their questions. And, you know, each week we're going to explore a bit more of Mississauga's history. So thank you very much, everyone. Sorry. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on Ask a Historian. Fumbling.
Thank you very much, Justine.